Vernon College, serving as the chair. Remind everybody that we are having the meeting broadcast over the internet. I welcome all the committee members back that are present today. To my knowledge, on the telephone with us today is Michael Reeser, Phil Rhodes, Brad Johnson. Is there anyone else on the phone to identify themselves? Thank you guys for joining us. Just as a reminder, if and when we do have a vote, those of you on the phone are 100% eligible to vote. Item 2 on today's agenda is consideration and approval of minutes from October 8, 2015 meeting. The materials that were sent out this past week had all of the minutes in there, the draft minutes. Do we have any comments or questions or corrections to the draft minutes that you looked at?
Who just joined, please?
Angela Robinson, Chancellor of Tarrant County College.
Welcome.
And thank you.
No changes, Mr. Chair. If there are no changes, Mr. Chair, I move that the minutes be approved.
Motion was made by Kelly Shoemaker to approve the minutes. Do we have a second?
I second.
Second by Jeremy McMillan. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. All opposed?
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Thank you very much. Item 3 is to continue our discussion on the Commissioner's 2018-2019 biennium charges for this committee. I know that we've been in tremendous discussion by email, and we've had a subcommittee meeting this morning. A lot of information had been sent out earlier for people to review in regard to funding levels, funding rates, and so forth. Let me just, for sake of this meeting, read charge 1 and 4. We have been choosing to address those as connected charges, as that maybe our strategies and ideals that we come up with would go toward answering both charges 1 and 4. So charge 1 is study and make recommendations for the appropriate funding levels for core, contact hour, and student success funding. Charge 4 was to study and make recommendations on changes to the funding model that will enable institutions to meet the goals of 60 by 30 Texas. Most of our discussion has centered around whatever we need to do, we'll be addressing both of those because they're both so important and connected to each other. We had a good review of information. We had a good subcommittee meeting this morning. And so at this time, I would open up for discussion, and I might pick on Pam Anglin to open that discussion because she's chairing that subcommittee.
Thank you, Dusty. In front of you, you have what the subcommittee used as a talking document this morning. But first of all, we're going to propose that we endorse the $200.2 million increase proposed by the Higher Ed Coordinating Board. In those priorities for funding, the first priority would be to fund the core at $75 million. That would be $1.5 million per college district during the next biennium. And then second, to fund the student success points at $185 per success point. Third would be, the balance would be distributed based on contact hours. And to note that this would eliminate the 90-10 split that has been in effect. So we'd move away from the 90-10 split, focus on funding the core operations, Fund student success points at $185 per success points, and then the balance distributed based on the contact hour distribution. Funding the core would go towards the 60 by 30 goal because it would help sustainability of all the small and rural community colleges. It would help in funds for institutions to purchase items and help with items that would go towards meeting the 60 by 30 goal. And then the funding the success points would go directly towards some incentive to increasing completion and working towards the 60 by 30 goal. I want to go back to the first item. The $200.2 million increase would be for the community colleges, and then endorse the state college increase of $1.8 million. The third item of discussion there on charge 1 is funding the BATs at the same rate for the 2016-17 biennium, and that would be the same rate as the GAIs. And then where all of this links together with charge 4, in each of our communities, the need is great, and that $200.2 million would allow community colleges to do more, including such things as increasing our academic dual credit offerings, increasing our CTE dual credit opportunities for students. It's very important that we have more CTE to attract those high school students that have never intended on being or have no aspirations to be college bound, but we need to get them workplace skills so that they're employable at the time they graduate. So doing this through CTE dual credit, where they graduate with certificates, can continue on with us towards associate degrees, but they do have workplace skills, marketable skills when they graduate from high school. And then with meeting the goals of the state for the future, some of that money would help in increasing workforce training opportunities on the college campuses. Also employment, and this would depend on different college needs, possibility of employment of additional student success coaches, additional advisors, or additions to ways to advise students to improve student completion rates, including ways to help those high school students get on track and stay on track, and making sure they're taking hours that will go towards whatever certificate or degree that they plan on working towards. Also, there's a need for software at many of the colleges to be able to better track student progress, monitor the milestones as they progress, and software to help identify intervention needs and to help retention of our students. Also, block scheduling. Additional funding would allow us to have resources to help us as we move forward with pathways and block scheduling. So that list is not exhaustive. That's just a first start at things that with additional funding the colleges could do and put in place to increase student retention and student completion and working towards the 60 by 30 goal. Then maintaining the current critical needs fields for the next biennium, but to request the coordinating board review critical needs considering statewide and regional workforce needs, and then making recommendations to be considered in 2017. Between now and our next meeting, we'll kind of formalize all of this. We're going to add a matrix that shows the 3 funding priorities, the 4 goals of the coordinating board and 60 by 30, and then list all of those items in that matrix to where you can see how what we're proposing would work towards each of those 4 coordinating board goals.
Thank you, Dr. Anglin. I just want to, for the record, in terms of number one, indicate that the coordinating board did not propose the $200.2 million. It's just a model that we generated at your request, and I just want to make sure the language was clear on that.
But when we looked at it, that we think that would be
Wonderful.
something that we want to endorse.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's just semantic, but I wanted to make it clear we weren't proposing it. Thank you.
Just as a reminder that it's not a proposal, so what is it? That draft ideal.
Yes.
We talked this morning, where did that come from? And a lot of that came with, some expected growth variables put in there.
And inflation.
And inflation and
yeah.
maybe a small increase in the rates of the contact hours themselves. And then as it all came to a head, that's the number that ended up. Right.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Correct. A lot of that's a lot of information, and some of you were not at the subcommittee meeting this morning, so we would try to answer any questions at this time. As Pam indicated, she's going to be working hard on a more thorough draft and getting it out to everybody in the next couple of weeks, but we would try to answer any questions at this time.
It's not a question, but I'm especially glad to see 4D down there for other kinds of support in helping the students. I think that's essential, and I'm glad to see it accounted for.
A comment I would make as you guys are thinking about your questions is that as we had this discussion by email and then as we had discussion this morning, I found it very interesting to me how the ideals we were coming up were really connected to the 60 by 30 Texas plan. I mean, that's how it's supposed to be anyway, but it was really interesting that it just came together really well in everybody's minds, I believe.
I'm pleased to hear that.
Yeah.
It's definitely
Good.
a student-focused plan. And
Very student-focused, yes,
positive.
ma'am. Does anyone in the group have any comment or question or concern in the fact that we are combining charges 1 and 4? And when I say combining them, our recommendation that we're going to come up with will, in essence, address both charge 1 and 4. Anybody have a concern with that? Brad, are you fine with that?
Yes, and I'm fine with that.
Thank you. I'm just making sure you were awake. Okay. We do not have, is there any specific, last time as we discussed these, we had some specific discussion in regard to dual credit. You can see that in the information that Pam placed in front of us, we did talk about how some of this additional funding could help us do some additional dual credit classes throughout our service areas. Is there any need to have any additional or specific discussion about dual credit in relation to charges 1 and 4? I take that as not at this time, and I appreciate it and agree with it. And so at this time, we're not going to bring forth to the committee for vote a recommendation on charge 1 and 4. I think we'll be all getting that soon, and then our expectation would be December 1st when we get back together that we'll be able to make that recommendation and vote on it at that time. Any further discussion on charges 1 and 4? We'll move forward. Charge 2, study and make recommendations for the appropriate funding level 4 and refinement of Texas State Technical College System's returned value funding formula. The work group for this has met a couple of times and has provided a recommendation for consideration. I'm looking for it as I speak. I hope you all have it in front of you. And with that, I would turn it over to Mike Reeser for any comments you'd like to make, Mike.
Thanks. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, just making sure. Cloistered away with headphones and a cell phone, so I couldn't tell if I was getting through. We have provided indeed a recommendation for the consideration of the committee. And frankly, I think the best way to read the draft that we provided is from the bottom up. So if you go to the end of the text, you'll find two bullets that point out the fact that we have no recommendations to make regarding dual credit or continuing education funding at this time. And like I reported out to the committee before, we had trouble finding a consistency in the data in such a way that the formula could be relied on to provide a clear picture of those. They also make up a very small amount of the overall funding picture. And so the recommendation of the subcommittee to the committee is that we make no effort to include those in the funding for this round, but suggest that we may want to continue to study the historical data and see if it stabilizes in the years ahead and could be reliably looked to for incorporation into the return value approach. Likewise, the next bullet up from the bottom is incorporate space support into the return value. TSTC has a hybrid kind of funding pattern and has for decades and decades. Space support, we refer to as infrastructure funding for TSTC, who doesn't have local tax income, is provided in a manner similar to the universities. It is roughly 3% an amount of about 3% is what that has historically been. What we are suggesting in order to comply with the directive from the legislature is to replace the space support funding item in TSTC's bill pattern with a 3% increase to the returned value funding formula, which is based on placement and salaries of the TSTC students. And this is, it does, not only does it comply with the directives of the legislature to depart from educational activity-based funding, but it also simplifies the formula. It essentially eliminates a line item in the funding bill or the bill pattern. And so it's really simple: eliminate the space support line item, but increase the return value funding model by 3 percentage points. There's frankly risks and benefits to TSTC in the long term. It's unclear as to exactly what that might contain for the system going forward, but we decided it was the right way to go because it complies with the directive we had to move away from contact hours and their erstwhile proxy semester credit hours, which drive the space support. You can see the bullet point above that recounts the directive out of the legislature. That language of abandoning contact hours is contained in the special provisions of the General Appropriations Act. And so we've restated it there as kind of a setup, if you will, or rationale for the space support move. Also, then moving up to the next bullet point up, it's fund $4.5 million in small institution supplement. This recommendation increases the small institution supplement because it accounts for 2 new campuses of TSTC that were authorized by the legislature and are, as startup operations, quite small. And so they qualify for the or they qualify for the small institution supplement. So we're suggesting that those get put in there. And then finally is the actual formula-driven funding, which is contained in the very topmost bullet point. These numbers are a result of what we believe will be the estimates for the general revenue dedicated funds that are part of the allocation for TSTC. These actually are estimates of what our tuition revenue will be. And then the general revenue itself is actually a computation that we believe will be the result of the funding formula for the next biennium. But it includes the increase, the 3% increase that is actually not an increase, it's just a transfer of the infrastructure formula over. And so the overall change, small institution appears to go up a lot on a percent basis, but it's actually $1.5 million. And that's a formulaic driven number. The revenue, GR dedicated is again the tuition estimates, and then the GR is a result of the formula. So the overall change that would come from this is a 11.4% increase, or a absolute amount of $16 million. And so that's the recommendation that the committee offers to the full two-year committee for consideration.
Thank you, Mike. Very good explanation, very good reasoning, and explain to us how the subcommittee's been working. I'd open the floor to, I would first see if we had a motion to accept that recommendation, and then we'd open it up for discussion. Mike, would that be a motion from you and the subcommittee?
If you seek a motion, I so move.
Okay. Motion by Mike Reeser that we accept that recommendation that's been presented. And from that point, I will open it up for discussion from any of the committee members. I'm still not parliamentary correct. Would we have a second for that motion? Thank you.
Brad, I'll second you.
Dr. David Leidick beat you to the punch. Now that we've had the recommendation made by motion with a second, I would open it up for discussion by any committee members. Hearing no discussion, I assume we're ready to vote. So all those in favor of the subcommittee recommendation in regard to charge 2 signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. I think we can say we've accomplished charge 2. Mike, I appreciate the hard work from you and your people and your subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to also point out that this work included lots and lots of hours of number crunching and support from the co-board staff. And there's no way we could have gotten this done in such a timely fashion without their steadfast support. So we offer our commendation to them.
I see everybody shaking their head and thank you. I agree with you 100%, Mike. Let's move on to charge 3. Charge 3 is to study and make recommendations on the treatment of competency-based courses and formula allocations. This one, for lack of a better word, kind of befuddled the group a couple of years ago. And then Roland was nice enough to send out some information that from the general academic institutions as they are wrestling with the same issue. and Dr. Leidick has made some comments on those back and forth between he and I. And I believe I sent out that information to the entire committee earlier this week. That's good. I did remember to do it. Okay. And, you know, we had a brief discussion on this at the end of the earlier subcommittee. So I would open it up for discussion, hear anybody's input, comments in regard to the treatment of competency-based courses and formula allocation. I would open it myself by saying what I think is an obvious thing, and I may be oversimplifying it, but to me, the fact that there's even a charge indicates that there should be a methodology that either rewards it greater or less or leaves it alone. To me, it's that simple. And so I'm not sure, there's not a whole lot of it going on out there. There are some pilot programs, but I think the question is it in being appropriately funding? So I would open up discussion with that.
This is Pam Anglin. When I think about the CBE, I think they're mastering student learning outcomes, just like a student would in an online course or a hybrid course. So at this point, I don't see why we don't keep our CBE courses tied to courses in the ACGM or in the Wickham manual and fund them in the contact hour formula, just as we do other modes of instruction.
Thank you, Pam. Any other comments or discussion?
This is Mike Reeser. I would build on Pam's comments and say I think that's an appropriate approach, although I think some rule changes may be required from the standpoint of the contact hour auditing process, because it is possible that in some CBE courses, mastery can be accomplished by students without as many seat hours in a course as a conventionally delivered course, and yet the rules for contact hour, particularly those in which the colleges are audited by the co-board, would probably need some sort of mention that there is the possibility that a student may master content faster than the 48 seat hours that would be in a typical 3-hour course. In other words, the intention could be there, but we could be in technical default, or colleges could be in technical default of the seat time requirement.
One thing I will mention, and I understand you got the materials from the General Academic Formula Advisory Committee. The two programs that we've been following, the one at South Texas College, which is working with Texas A&M Commerce, the way the funding has been set up for that is that it's funded upon the student's completion of all the models affiliated with the course, and it means the student has to reach a mastery level for each model. Those courses are affiliated with semester credit hours and with our existing courses, so they fit in that model, but it's not that the funding comes in on the 12th class day when the student is first attempting. It's the funding happens after the student has finished all of the modules, achieved mastery, and they're reported to us generally as flex for that reason, because we don't know until the end of the period of time. I think mostly they have 7-week sections, but a student can finish at different points in time. So that is what it looks like right now the general academics are going to be including in their recommendations. So it's a little bit different than the traditional.
Yeah, I think that was, I think that was always my assumption, is that it could take fewer hours, but typically it takes longer. And Mr. Young is in his alternative possibilities here in the figuring suggests that one, I suppose, disadvantage is the lag in funding because the student takes longer to finish. But I think what you're describing is what I always assumed. I honestly hadn't thought about the fewer hours it might take, just that funding would happen upon completion. And that's the whole idea of competency-based, is they work at their own pace. That's the whole idea. And so a fewer numbers of hours, I hadn't really thought about that as a practical problem.
Right, and if a student...
This is Brad. I'm will confess that doing this by phone does leave one at a distinct disadvantage in this discussion. So if my question is too far off base, you have my apology in advance. But one question that came up as I read that was whether this approach does, for competency-based instruction, does mean that the only funding received is completion funding, that there is no funding for partial work. The funding credit only is applied when the student completes.
That's correct.
So dropouts are funded and managed by the institution without reimbursement. Am I thinking of that right?
That's correct in terms of these two programs right now that we're funding for competency-based. They're state-funded for South Texas College and A&M Commerce. If the student does not successfully complete, then it is not reported to us.
Mm-hmm. And I guess my comment to that, if we're speculating about how to take something statewide, is that my concern with all outcome funding has always been that over time, the institution's need for funds can become a clash against academic standards and quality. And I just wonder what thought we are having as a committee about if you're working, for example, within a program that may be a high need in your area for which a lot of students who enter do not complete, is there a unintended negative impact that the institution is incentivized to lower their standards in determining competence?
I could offer you this based on our experience with at TSTC with both SACS and DOE, and that is there is a particularly keen scrutiny on the assessment tools that we use to demonstrate mastery. And more so than all of the assessment and talk that SACS has done in the past, it's particularly a keen look at that. I think it would be particularly difficult to get through a SACS approval for one's competency-based approach and leave a lot of room for compromise on quality.
And I have no doubt that that is true at this point. I'm asking, though, about what we see within any sort of bureaucratic system, what impact that has over the years. For example, as the high-stakes testing movement moved through public ed, in its inception, my understanding was that it did a pretty good job of refocusing educators' attention on the educational endeavor, but eventually it became teaching to the test issue to such a broad degree that we're struggling now to unwind some of what has been created. So I'm just asking, as we begin to look at the competency-based movement, whether we are considering that part of the impact in this proposal.
Well, it strikes me as a good question because, of course, for outcomes-based funding, I mean, this is a good reminder, if nothing else, because the question among a lot of faculty, for example, and the Texas Community College Teachers Association position has always been, you don't want to focus on outcomes in such a way that you in any way exert subtle or sometimes not so subtle pressure on teachers to pass students who shouldn't be passed. That you maintain, the word used a minute ago was quality, that you maintain the rigor of the class. If we expand to the competency-based, that same question, I don't know the process so much. It strikes me that it might be a harder thing to exert pressure. And I mean, if you complete modules and you take the test for the competency-based, I don't know if that could be, I don't know if pressure can be exerted in the same way. I'm not sure the concern is quite the same, but it might be as the modules are developed, as they evolve, as tests evolve, we don't want the measures, in other words, to become more lax because there's now money tied to these students passing. We don't want any student passing who shouldn't be passing. And we just want to avoid the pressure exerted in faculty that might cause or perceive them to think they're being asked to pass students who don't deserve it.
Brad, I think you've brought up the one of the many $64,000 questions in our profession. Is anytime we do anything, what's the cause and effect? And we often go toward, we sure don't want to see a reduction in quality, a reduction in rigor, and it's a legitimate question. But I think I'm enlightened that that's how the funding is happening on the two pilots. I don't know that I totally understood that. Don't know that I ever asked anybody. But it makes a little sense to me that you're if it's competency-based education, you're funding the competency, which is kind of the epitome of performance funding. It really is. And Brad's question would be, Brad, don't let me talk for you, but basically if you got 10 students and 5 of them don't make it to the end, you still got the cost associated with 10 students. And so it's a legitimate question. At the same time, it appears that a decision was made somewhere that it's not going to be enrollment driven. It's completion driven.
Again, just for the
two pilots, correct?
Yes.
Correct.
So.
Okay. Well, as everybody thinks of those things and comments and concerns, if you'd shoot me an email, I would try to put those together in some fashion.
Julie, this is a question for Julie. What's the length of that pilot?
And actually, they haven't referred to it as a pilot because it's ongoing. They were provided some startup funds, and I actually just emailed Judith, who's got expertise here, but it's an ongoing program that they're having at these institutions.
And
so there won't be an end point.
Yeah, and I guess I asked that sort of in what I just heard as far as would there be an evaluation both on the success of the student as well as on the success of the funding, how that worked, so that there might be a reason for a change,
Yes,
I guess is where I'm going.
There's certainly evaluation involved, and we'd be happy to share that. I also would be happy if there's more information that I can provide back to you related to the funding. Perhaps we could ask some additional questions of the folks in those programs about how many students begin and don't complete. Those types of things, I'd be happy to see if we could get you more information if you would like to have that. This is obviously very, very new area but that we believe will be growing, as Judith mentioned in her presentation.
And I guess when I think about any sort of change, I think if you tried to take that same model and look at the way we're funded with a 12th class day count, to me applies a certain percentage of the course. Could that still not be somewhat applied to a competency-based when a certain student has reached a certain percentage? And I don't know, because I don't know how it works. Do they just take a test at the end? Can you find a percentage where you could say, if they've stayed around for X percent, it's funded? I don't know. And I'm back to your question. I don't know enough about it. I can only ask questions.
Yes, and I know there's a real variability in terms of how those courses are built. Right now, that we're only funding those that are linked to semester credit hours, and that's pretty much the case. I'm sorry, to contact hours, but it's semester credit hours for the university. So we link them back to the courses in the ACGM or to the university courses. But it's many of them are built with modules, and it's not that every course is going to have 10 modules or 12 modules. There's different, it's set up depending on how they build those competencies. So I don't think I could say if a student moves through 3 or 4, that would be a certain percentage. I don't believe that's how it's set up based on my understanding. So I think it would probably take a little work to think about it along the lines that you're talking about, how that might be structured were one to do it that way.
Okay. Well, it's nice to know that it's being evaluated, so we'll
Yes, and there
wait
is
on the
a
evaluation.
and Paul Turcotte is here. They've begun a cost study for the A&M Commerce. They didn't have enough data for it. Some information was provided to the general academics on the cost study for A&M Commerce for that program. They're going to look at it again when they get together in 2 years. It really wasn't enough information to get a sense of where the costs were coming in. Yeah.
Excuse me, Dusty, when David Young sent us these alternative, or these possibilities, isn't the second one what we're talking about now? What he says is that a possibility is to fund institutions based on the fraction of total number of competencies in a CBE program that a CBE student completes during the semester. Then the formula is number of modules over total number of modules, and then some. Isn't that we're the same thing, right? That we're
What
talking
Kelly's
about
talking
funding
about.
based on some fraction, some percentage completed, not the whole thing completed. Okay.
I think that's what Kelly's asking, and, just getting down to the bare bones, we're saying, that if a student only completes half of it, but they're competent at half, there's still been a cost involved in providing that opportunity, and can that be reimbursed in some form or fashion?
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think that's
I just
right.
wanted to be sure that what I was reading here from Mr. Young was the same thing
That's
we're
the
talking
same.
about.
That's what
Yeah,
Kelly.
sounds good.
The other thing I do want to mention related to those alternatives, and I'll ask Mr. Young to jump in if he wants to add anything here, but we know that right now there's some experimental federal projects that are happening around the country. There's a couple in Texas. They are not moving forward yet. There's some things that I believe are delaying them, but they are projects where the competency-based education doesn't have to link back to the contact hours or the semester credit hours. And I think some of these alternatives we also wanted to put forth for should things move in that direction. And some of the federal projects, of course, looking at financial aid, because that's a real challenge with these models that aren't linked back to traditional coursework. But should something like that move forward, there'll also be the challenges of how you fund something that way that isn't linked right now to a contact hour and therefore a set amount of funding. So I would look at these through those eyes as well, through that lens as well, that where do we go? And this might be something that 2 years from now this committee, or it's certainly something you can discuss today, but where do we go when that happens and there's approval for those types of competency-based programs if that does in fact happen at the federal level? Yeah.
My concern is still that institution has some delivery cost, some instructional cost, and if it's funded by completion at the time of completion, and the student doesn't complete, they've still been out that instructional cost. So I'm concerned about funding on a completion basis.
Additional comments?
I think the universities have a charge to look at this as well. And so what is their parallel pathway? Is it sort of what we're doing here?
And I believe you were sent that Mr. Young sent you the material.
Yes, I'm trying to find emails, so I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, we'd be happy to share it. They had their meeting yesterday, and it looks like they're going to move forward with the recommendation, which, and not those, I don't know how exactly they were sent to you, but not the alternative approaches, but the recommendation, which, and Paul, do you think it's appropriate for me to read what their recommendation is? I'm going to read what it is. I don't believe they made any changes to it yesterday. And again, they haven't finalized their report, so there could be a change, but I can tell you where they came down. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I found it here. but-
Okay. So it's what you all have then that should just say fund competency-based education courses, not modules, using the existing formula calculation. Does everyone have that? I won't read it if you all have it.
Yep.
That's,
I forwarded it to you guys. It came from Roland to me, and then I forwarded it to you guys.
we could very quickly get some copies made. Would that
I think that's fine.
Everyone's okay? All right, so let me just finish the first part, because I think that's the part that's relevant. So using fund competency-based education courses, not modules, using the existing formula calculation and updated expenditure-based weights for the 18-19 biennium. These are sub-bullets. Institutions offering competency-based programs should report hours to the coordinating board upon the student's completion of all the modules associated with the course. The expenditure study should include the course's expense and hours reported for the respective fiscal years. Fund hours through the formula for courses where the student attained mastery of the subject at the institution through instruction or independent study. Exclude hours where the student obtained mastery of the entire course prior to enrolling in the program. This includes not funding credit attained through CLEP tests or similar evaluation practices through the formula. So that basically means that it couldn't just have been assessment of prior learning and you got the credit. There had to be some instruction involved.
So I appreciate that. The other question I have that courses trigger other things for us, success points being one of those. And so how was success points derived from first course completion of math and all those things be figured into this? And so there's a lot of things that are connected, and so it's hard to undo the system that we have. So I guess that's more of a comment than it is a question, but
Well, I'm very familiar with success points, having worked closely with them here at the coordinating board. The success points are based on students successfully moving forward, if that's helpful. So a student with the 15 and 30 hours for success points, the student has to successfully complete those. There's not points earned for a student just enrolling. The student has to successfully complete with an A, B, or C the first college level course to get the success points. They have to earn the degree. They have to transfer those types of things. So, that is something to keep in mind as you think about the competency-based and funding on mastery. That's certainly the success point piece. None of that is earned just for attendance.
So my point there is if you did as a percentage of the course completed and get the funding, you'd have to have a separate data point to know that they completed the course.
Right, and that is collected. When it's reported at mastery, we collect that information, and that's included now for any courses reported as flex. They're included as part of success points, or reported at the end of the semester in this case.
Just because it's one of my favorite things to always over-clarify and over-simplify is that even if a college has 10 people complete a CBE course, they do not generate any funding. They simply affect the allocation that's coming to that college.
Thank you.
There we go. I mean, it's one of the things that just drives me crazy in this whole system of how we talk about we're generating dollars, when really this is just another methodology, another variable to figure out how that institution is going to get a little piece of their pie.
Thank you very much, and I should have clarified that way, and
That's okay.
I do appreciate that.
But it all plays together, as Jeremy is saying. It all comes back around one way or the other. Yeah. Well, I'll not close discussion. I'll continue discussion if anybody wants to add more. But while you're thinking, I would say this has been the best discussion we've had in 4 years, and in my opinion. And so if you would send any points you would like to make to me, I will try to collect and put those into some sensible document, and including the general academic institutions information, send it back to you for review, and then we'll see where we're at that point. Any further discussion? that gets us through charge 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we've accomplished charge 2. We feel capable of coming back in December with a good recommendation for charge 1 and 4, which Pam and Kelly and some others are going to work hard on, Diane, I believe, and get that out to us, and hopefully we can get through emails and have it in a form of a recommendation that we can all look at and be comfortable with in December. And then I will take on the task of trying to do the same thing with charge 3 about competency-based, getting that in some form, getting enough email interaction going back and forth between committee members to where we would like to have that resolved by December 1 as well. All that bringing to my point that I hope when we get back on December 1, we could vote on 1, 3, and 4, and we would bring our work to conclusion. Any other comments or questions or discussion? Anybody want to make a motion to adjourn? Jeremy made that motion. Thank you, Jeremy. Well, at this time, do we have a second? Thank you, Pam. Motion made and second to adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say nay. Then we will call this meeting adjourned. Thank you very much. And Brad, I'm glad you didn't fly down here. In case you're still here, he may have hung up immediately.